What I want us to think about today is how do we talk about Jesus? So I want you to stop for a moment and think, what are 3 words, or if you're a pastor like me and you can't limit yourself to 3, or you can't limit yourself to words, you got to do phrases or stories. What are 3 things about Jesus that are the most important to you? So I want to call one out.
Loving.
Loving.
I was going to say it's loving kindness.
Loving kindness, good. Anything else?
Forgiving.
Forgiving.
Understanding.
Understanding.
Generosity.
Generosity. And now maybe what is a story or an example from his life that you're like, every time I hear that story on Sunday morning or I read that one in the Bible, I go, yeah, that's what this is all about. He died for us.
The Sermon on the Mount.
Sermon on the Mount.
He was a teacher.
He was a teacher. But the reality is, even as we think of all these things, I suspect, and sometimes it's harder to get at, we could also start thinking about what are the ones that we don't like to think about. Those are the harder ones to remember because we push them down. The part maybe we want to skim over when we're reading, or we get a little uncomfortable when the reader stands up and starts reading from it. Maybe if you don't like things to be disturbed and you like things the way they are, you don't like that image of Jesus flipping over the tables and driving out the money changers. Especially if you work in the banking industry, you might get a little anxious about that. Maybe it's that passage with the rich young ruler and Jesus says you got to give up everything and follow me. Or when he tells that disciple, let the dead bury the dead, give up your family and come and follow. I think we're honest, as you read through the Gospels, each one of us has some parts that we get a little uncomfortable about. We wonder, is that really what Jesus meant? He didn't really say that, right? Some aspect of him that's tough for us to fully get behind in some way or another. But as we look at the story of the Transfiguration, I think what the real message, or one of the messages, because every time I come to it, I come with a little bit different. But I think one of the heart of this story is that you can't simplify Jesus down to one thing. Because in fact, if most of us were going to reduce Jesus down, and we have some good adjectives, but one of the things we talk about with Jesus is, he's the Son of God, right? In fact, if you're going to try and tell someone about why Jesus is so important, Son of God might be one of those ones we come with first. But what does Jesus do in his ministry? He's got this moment on the mountain, and Peter and a couple of the disciples are there, and they hear this voice that says, "This is my Son, listen to him." And Jesus tells the disciples, he says, "Don't tell anyone else about this until after I've risen from the dead." But it seems like that would be the thing that would strengthen his ministry the most if everyone just understood this is the Son of God and God has ordained him and we have to listen to him. It seems really important to us, and yet it's not what Jesus leads with. He starts with teaching and preaching. He starts with healing and caring for people and listening to people. I don't think he's saying that the Son of God bit isn't important. But I think he doesn't want it to become the only part of why we follow him. There's more to Jesus than just being the Son of God. And I think Jesus understands that we're going to want to simplify things down as part of who we are. Because most of us, when when faced with a complex and challenging thing, we have one temptation or another. Either we tend to sort of say, I can't deal with all of this, so I'll deal with just this little bit that I can. Or we get kind of paralyzed. Oh, there's just too much, I'm not sure. Hopefully you find that middle ground in the middle where you go and deal with it. But the reality is, I think most of us tend to go with the simplifying, taking the little bits, or that dazzling complexity. In fact, we see that with Peter. He's sitting there, he's going, there are these three transcendent beings in front of me. I don't know, let's build tents for them. We'll put up tents and they can stay here on the mountain because I'm not sure what else to do. Peter's overwhelmed and isn't sure. And in fact, when we look at ourselves, when we look at how we deal with things, we like things simple. As a society, we like dichotomies. I think maybe it's because we tend to have a two-party system, or maybe that's why we have a two-party system. It's easy to go, you're either a Republican or you're a Democrat. You're on the left or you're on the right. You're with us or you're against us. Right? We like things simple. It's right or it's wrong. Those shades of gray, those things in the middle, they make it hard. I agree with him on that thing, but I disagree on something else. It's harder to put people in boxes the more we know about them, the more we come to learn. We just want things simple, because the reality is we just don't have time for everything to be complex. You know, your eye sees way more than your brain processes. And it's a really good trait, because otherwise I don't think we could handle things. You tend to focus on things, you tend to pay attention to some stuff and not other stuff. Because otherwise we have that danger of being dazzled by the complexities. You know, a great example of that to me is, have you ever thought about how you measure a coastline? Because now, if you're going to draw a really rough map of the United States, you're going to use nice straight lines, right? And you can kind of go, this is the distance. But coastlines aren't straight, especially if you go to Norway. You go to Norway, they're really not straight. And so if you have this simple thing, you would just draw a simple thing. What's the length of the coastline of Norway? You'd come up with a number that's way off of what it is because of all the fjords, right? All these ins and outs and dips and little bits. And in fact, any coastline, because it goes up and down. You just think about Minnewaska and all the little dips and bays and everything. You can't draw just these simple straight lines. They keep getting smaller and smaller and more angles, and it gets more, right? The deeper you go, the harder it is to figure out just how much is there. It's just like for us as three-dimensional creatures trying to imagine what a fourth dimension is like. Or as I told my confirmation kids the other week, I said, you know, when you draw 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional piece of paper, it's hard, right? Because you draw that line and you go, well, that's supposed to be kind of coming out of the paper at us, except you can't draw a line that comes out of the paper at us. That complexity is hard to represent in that simple way we want to represent it. And yet we need to go deeper. We can't just throw our hands up and do nothing. We have to take that time to figure things out. So how do we understand that whole message of Christ? I mean, you could just start by reading all 4 Gospels back to back. Part of why I think we have 4 Gospels, is because we know it's complicated. There's very few things that are exactly the same in each of the 4 Gospels. A couple of miracles, the resurrection, a few sayings. But each author tells a slightly different part. of Jesus' story. Each author highlights things a little bit differently. Even how Matthew and Mark address that same story of Jesus on the mountaintop with the disciples is slightly different because of what stands out to each author. Because understanding Jesus isn't simple. It takes work. One of the things we're trying to talk about over and over in our church is that our vision is to be growing our faith and serving our community. We talk about growing our faith because we recognize that faith is not a binary thing. You don't just have faith or you don't have faith. Because if anyone who ever believed in God knows there's days you're like, yeah, God, and then there's days you're like, really, God? That might have been me this morning when I looked out and saw the snow and everything. I thought it's Sunday morning, really, God? This is the last thing Marianne and I needed was this? Faith is complex. God is complex. And we know it's a process of understanding. A process that takes a lifetime. Probably a lifetime and then some. But it's something we have to keep doing. We don't want to reduce God down to a couple of sound bites, a few phrases, some main ideas, a children's sermon. Because God is something that takes a lifetime for us to grasp. Faith is something that takes work. And it's something that's best done in community. Even the mystics that would go off in isolation in Egypt, in the desert, still had communities. Communities amongst hermits. It's sort of a paradox, and yet they even understood there's times we need to gather together. We share our perspectives with one another. We learn from how other people have seen and experienced God, how they're hearing the story. Because otherwise, we lose too much detail. We need that rich perspective. We need to hear the whole message of who Jesus is. Several years ago now, and maybe someone like Dave or Joanne, who's part of the United Church of Christ when it happened, can tell me when the God is Still Speaking campaign came out. I want to say it was in the 2000s, but the United Church of Christ came out with this message, God is still speaking. And I love it because it's a reminder to us that we live, we worship a living God. We're part of a living faith. God is not done speaking. God is not done doing. So we can't be done learning. We can't be done growing. We need to keep working to get that full picture of who Christ is. To get that better understanding of who God is and how that affects our lives. We don't want to reduce God to that moment on the mountaintop. It's all dazzling. That one story, that one example. God is so much more. Our challenge as disciples is to keep listening for God's voice. To keep learning about who God is and to keep seeking to grow in our faith. That we can get a better understanding all the amazing things that God has done and God is doing for each one of us. Amen.